Alright, hey everyone. Can you guys hear me fine? Let's see. I'm just setting up Instagram Live as well. Just give me a second. All right. Yeah, so this will if you guys if you guys are on YouTube and you haven't downloaded the image and you want to work with me, you can actually go to the descriptions and just click the Google Drive link and just have the image downloaded. I provided I think JPEG and RAW file, so it just depends on which one you want to use. But today what we'll be covering this hour is we'll be going through Photoshop, the basics. So I'm going to be teaching camera raw, and then I'll show you how to process an image with green, as well as adding some mood to it. So nothing super advanced, just since it's the first edit with me, we'll go through the basics first, and then we can go a bit more up as we go in the future weeks. So I'm going to start. So if you haven't downloaded the image, just go to the descriptions in the YouTube live link and have it downloaded, and you can work along with me. I'll be taking my time so you can catch up for sure. The first thing you do is you would import the raw file into Photoshop. When you drop the file into Photoshop, the camera raw tab would pop up. But if the file is already in Photoshop, you can just double click here. Oh, hi everyone that's joining in. Yeah, it's good to have you guys. So yes, if you guys are hearing some background noise, it's my computer. I think the stream's actually taking a lot of GPU or something, so it's actually really loud. So I'm sorry about that. So this is the image and how it looks in RAW. So the first thing I like to do is actually look at the histogram. So the histogram's telling me that the details are not that dynamic. So there's no details here. There's no details here. So the first thing I normally do is I would bring that back. By lowering the blocks, you can move this part of the curve to here. And what this does is you can see that it's making the image a bit darker. And that's because the details that were here are now here. And the next thing we do is we slide the whites. Depending on where the end of the curve is, if it's not touching the right end, you will slide the whites to the right. And just look at the histogram while you're sliding it. There's no set number. And then you slide it until the tip of the tip here is touching here, or really close to it. If you go too much, you're going to see a very overexposed image. You just go a tiny bit, so we get that dynamic range. Let's see. Let me just check the questions. If there's any. All right, so no questions. We're good to. Yeah, so another thing to watch out for is temperature. So sometimes we might photograph the image a bit too cold, or it might be a bit too warm. So we should always look at the overall color. In this image, I think the temperature is just fine, but we can adjust the slider to see if something fits better. So just slowly move the slider back and forth. You can see that when you're moving it here, it gets really cold or blue. And as you slide it to the right, it gets more warm and yellow. So what we want is a balance of the two. Unless it's blue hour or sunset, you're not going to want it to look particularly warm or cold. So you just find a good balance. What we want is you want to have a bit of blue in the shadows and a bit of yellow in the highlights. So something like that. The next thing is exposure. For this image, it really depends. If you want a very moody kind of edit, you would actually lower exposure. And now you can see the overall image is a bit underexposed, and you bring out the details by raising up the shadows. So you're kind of, and the key to making a image feel moody is to make the overall image extra dark, and that gives it that kind of feel. And for highlights, because it really depends. If you want the clouds to show up, you would lower the highlights. But if you prefer a really white kind of sky, you would raise the highlights. So it totally depends on your preference. I'll be showing you a couple of different editing styles. So for the first one, we'll actually be lowering the highlights. And then contrast, I almost never increase contrast here. I normally would just decrease it, because what I find is most of my images taken on my camera are extra hard to begin with, so I often soften it up with the contrast slider. So the next thing we'll look at is curves. I'm not going into specific details for the curves, because curves on its own is like a 3-hour kind of lesson. So we're just going to make a basic S-curve. And what the S-curve does is it brings contrast to an image. Because we lowered the contrast earlier, these two kind of undo each other. But what's important is to get that mood, you would raise the end of the curve here. You can see that you can't raise it too much. When you raise it super high, it becomes really faded. But if you do it a little, you get this vintage or kind of a bit of a faded kind of feeling, I guess. And for the whites, it totally depends on your preference. If you don't want pure whites, you would lower it a bit. Or if you're planning to do very exposed image, but you don't want the whites to kind of hurt the viewer's eyes, you would lower that as well. But because we're doing more of a dynamic image, we're going to keep the whites as it is up here. Let me just check questions. Nope, we're good. Let's see, what camera do you use? Yeah, so I'm using the Sony A7R III. I've been using it for the past, I think, 2 years now. Really loving it. The dynamic range is amazing, and I really love the timer for the still shots. It's also the shutter speed is really quick, and I really like the size and how compact it is, I guess, versus my old Canon Mark IV. That one was pretty bulky. And so now it depends. If I'm going to process it, because we're going to process it in Photoshop, I'm really not going to raise texture or clarity or anything. I personally sharpen at the end if I'm going to do Photoshop, but if you're planning to just if you're just planning to do, let's say, Lightroom or just Camera Raw and export the image, definitely increase the texture a bit. And by increasing texture, I recommend lowering clarity, or else the image is going to be a bit too sharp and you might get rough edges. But since we're doing more editing in Photoshop, 0, 0. Same with sharpness. Because we're editing in Photoshop, I'm dropping this to 0 as well. And I'll show you why. So sharpness is very important. It can turn your image from very soft to actually, the details will start actually showing contrast. If you just focus on here, you can see the difference is pretty, yeah, it's very different. But as you raise the sharpness, you're going to see a lot more grain here versus having sharpness at 0. So it's a total trade-off. If you're, I'm very protective of my pixels, so I try not to sharpen right away, especially if I'm going to edit for another few hours on this. That's why I choose 0. But if you're going to export and let's say share on Instagram or like another social media that does not have a huge screen, definitely raise the sharpness to maybe something like this. Because when you're viewing it like this, I don't think anyone can notice. But if you're viewing it on a large screen, let's say, you're going to notice it's going to be here. So that's why I said that. But for our purposes, we're keeping it at 0. Vibrance is pretty much saturation, but it actually adjusts the midtones or the colors that aren't that obvious. So when I raise vibrance, you can see that the orange isn't really changing that much. Instead, we're getting the blues and the areas here. Saturation pretty much changes everything. So you can see that orange is actually changing a lot. And what I like to do is, it depends on the situation. For images like this, I would do vibrance. And same thing with all other sliders. If you're going pretty crazy with one slider, you should do the opposite for the other slider. That pretty much does the same job. And let's see, should I add some vignette? Yeah, I think I will add some vignette. And you can see that when you look at the histogram, you see that there's a big peak here. So that just means that there's a lot of details in this area. By doing a vignette, most of the time, you can get rid of, or you can darken a lot of the brighter areas. You can see the more vignette you put, the more darker everything becomes. So vignette's really important in creating mood. And what midpoint does is it pretty much changes the how much area the vignette covers. So just, well, look at the image. Stop. I'll do something like this. Roundness just determines if the vignette is round or square. So I prefer circular. And feather just shows how harsh the vignette is. Let's do 100. Yeah, so at this point, this is what we have. You can see that the saturation is only being changed a little, and I'm going to show you how to further enhance the saturation and why I prefer doing these adjustments in Photoshop instead of Lightroom. But all the settings here and everything being shown today, you can do in Lightroom as well if you're not familiar with Photoshop, it's just, you just have to do the settings, export the image, put the image back into Lightroom, and then do the adjustments again, which I'll explain a bit later. So once we're at this point, we can click OK. Oh, one thing to notice is I didn't do lens correction because I personally don't like doing lens correction most of the time, unless I'm doing a 70, unless it's a 70 to 200 lens, because the distortion actually adds into the photo, in my opinion, and also gives it a nice vignette. Yeah, so click OK, and this will be our first camera raw adjustment. If you're in, one thing to note is if you're following along and you're doing this on Photoshop and it's not showing this little paper or document on the bottom when you're importing into Photoshop, it's because of this. So you click the bottom here, have this setting checked, open in Photoshop as Smart Object. What this does is when you're opening a file into Photoshop, it stays as a Smart Object. What Smart Object is, you can just think of it as a raw file, versus if you have it unchecked. If this is unchecked, you're importing as a JPEG, so it's a flattened layer, which means you can't really get your camera raw adjustments anymore. Let me just show you. So this is what you will get if you don't have that option checked. It's just a layer. When you do camera raw, it's whatever the adjustments you already made, and all the and you can't really adjust it anymore. Let's say you didn't really like the color, you want it to be more saturated. The sliders are already 0, which means that the raw file actually got flattened, and this is just a single layer, versus this one. If you double click it, you're still getting all your settings here. And I personally prefer this because let's say I need to do some changes. I can just change it again, and then I click OK, and the change is applied. But wow, I just noticed the blue here is a little strong, so I can just go back. I can just go to my HSL tab and lower the blues. Let me just check if there's any questions. Oh, so yeah, for the Photoshop UI, let me check for time. Yeah, I can spend 5 minutes on that. So for Photoshop, because this is our first video, we're just going through camera raw. I'll just be explaining what things we'll be going through. So the only thing we need to actually understand for today's lesson is camera raw and brush, and I will explain them as we go through these. Let's see. Can you pin the name, please? What can we use? I'm in love with your photograph. All right. So we're going to apply another camera raw to this. So camera raw is a plugin in Photoshop, and it's under filter. So you go up here, filter, and here's all the other filters, but the one we're focusing on is camera raw filter. So when you click it, this is equivalent to pretty much putting the photo back into Lightroom to process and put back into Photoshop. And what we're noticing here is that the color still feels very desaturated. So we can increase the vibrance some more, and you can see that the colors are coming out more and more. And the reason we do this is I think the reason we do this is that if you put multiple layers of saturation sliders, the colors will just become more and more obvious. And sometimes an image is very colorless. Let's say a rain, like you're in a rainy kind of like forest. But you can, if you just keep sliding the vibrance over and over, the colors will come out. And what we're doing here is we're going to be doing more adjustments. So it totally depends on what you prefer. When you raise highlights, you're blowing it up. But for our first image, I want to keep it dynamic. So I'm actually going to lower the highlights, and then I'll increase the whites. And you can see that you're getting, the second camera raw adjustment is creating a lot more contrast, and a lot more color. And what I will do now is I will show the radial filter. These three are the same as Lightroom. What the radial filter does is you can add a localized adjustment. And what the radial filter, for me, I think of it as light because it's kind of circular. I kind of make it represent, I guess, the sun or beams of light that's kind of shining through. And I'll show you why this filter is so essential to this image. So you raise the, because we're going to make this image, or making this filter be light, we should increase the exposure. And when I increase exposure, I tend to decrease contrast. The rest of the settings adjust based on your personal preference. I would increase highlight. Shadows, I would increase a bit, maybe lower the blacks a bit. Actually, I would increase blacks and lower shadows. And then saturation, yeah, so something like this. And then you just drag it. So the center is where the adjustment is strongest. And the edges, it gets softer. So that's why it's really nice to, it will feel like a light is coming in. So just slide it around until your eyes kind of catch an image that's kind of pleasing, I guess. So do something like that. Quick before and after. And always, for before and after in Camera Raw, you just click P. It's a shortcut. It's really convenient because it shows you what the image, it shows you what the eyes might not catch if you just keep looking at the edited version. So I can see that this part's a bit overexposed. So I would actually lower my whites a bit. And then lower the highlights a bit. So we're getting something like this. And then it feels like the color's a bit too warm. So we're going to the split tones. And what the split tones is it adds a color to the highlights and it adds a color to the shadows. So because it's too warm, we're going for the shadows first. Shadows are normally blue, so that's why most of the time you want this slider to be somewhere around here. And just don't go too much, maybe a 8 or 9. And for highlights, it's generally, if you're doing a sunset, it's yellow. But if it's any time of, or like if it's not really a sunset, you can technically do any color you want. For us, I'm feeling a green, a mix of green and blue, feeling something like here. Yeah, so now you're getting this this green color in the top, which kind of resembles the sun kind of shining onto the trees, and you're pretty much making the effect more obvious. But we also do notice the blue is also getting a bit strong. So again, same thing, saturation, lowering the blues a bit. And now we'll use the radial filter to bring more underexposed. So anything that's not really the focus, and what we'll be focusing on is, I think, this area. So that's where we want the light to be. Anywhere else, we're going to make it darker. And the radial filter, just lower your exposure to something like that. And then we'll keep highlights up, contrast down, shadows, let's see, unfeeling. All these sliders, just slide them until you find something that you like. There's nothing, there's no right or wrongs, except for if you just go like saturation 100 or saturation -100, or if you do dehaze too much. But any adjustments here, you can just play with them. Let's see. Yeah, so something like that. And for the clouds here, we're going to also add a bit of underexpose a bit too. So that was the before, and this is the after. So we're going to add one final radial filter. And what this one is going to be is it's going to be a very distinct light ray. So we're going to give it some warmth, some exposure. And you can rotate it, you can pull it. It's very flexible. So I'm thinking the light is coming through like this. So we're just going to make it follow the path of the light. So something like that. And you can see that with the addition of this, it's a very, now the image is getting a lot more depth, and it's starting to look more different from the before. But when you bring in this, you can see that this part's a bit oversaturated, so you just drop the saturation a tiny bit. So yeah, let me see if we have any questions. Yeah, hey everyone who's joining. All right, so click OK. And now you can see a camera raw filter here. What this is, you can just double click. It's the same as before. Any changes, you can make any changes that you, I guess you can make some changes if you didn't like what the image turned out to be. And that's why I like Photoshop. It's so flexible. You can change the camera raw adjustments here, and you can also change the camera raw adjustments here. And that makes it so much more so much more selective and so much more free, I guess. You can be editing, and eventually, after like an hour, you realize you've made a mistake. You can always go back and correct it. So I'm going to show you curves. So adjustment layers is down here. You can see the kind of like the half circle, or like a circle was half shaded in. The most used adjustment layer is probably curves. And what we're going to be using this for is we're going to add some extra mood into this photo. So just drop it a bit. If you're making one adjustment and you're just dragging it down, what this means is you're making the overall image darker. And when you raise the tail, you're making the darkest detail a bit lighter. So we're just going to give it a little smiley face kind of shape. And you can see that without any other adjustments, the image is getting really, really dark. And what we're going to do with this is we're going to actually paint in the sides to be a bit darker than what they are right now, and this would create that. This will just give this image an extra bit of mood. So I'm going to go through layer masks pretty briefly. I'll probably release a video in the future covering specifically curves and layer masks. So if you're a bit confused, it's alright. And what layer masks do is it covers up your adjustment, so it allows you for really localized adjustment. And you can see here that the white is essentially a layer mask. White just means that everything is showing. The opposite is black. Black means nothing is showing. So what we will be doing is we're going to make the layer mask black, and you can do that by right click. I think it's just fill. Let's see. Yeah, I use shortcuts, so I'm just trying to figure out what's the best way to do it. I know. Oh, shift delete. Yeah. So just click shift delete, and let me see, blend mode, and just do black, and then you can make the whole thing black, and then shift delete again if you want to make it white. But what I prefer is I actually just look at the colors here. Actually, I'm not going to explain, it's a little confusing. So yeah, so shift delete and just make it black. And then you're going to use the gradient tool. Click G for that, or just do the gradient tool here. And then you go into here. Make sure that this part is transparent. And make sure here it's a color, white or black. And you're just going to drag. What this does also, the opacity matters. So I set it to 70%. If you're dragging like this, it's going to be a lot more harsher. But if you start from the bottom and drag up, the effect is a lot more subtle. And we're just going to do the edges. And what this creates is, it creates some more contrast for here. And we're going to bring some more light into this. So another curves adjustment. And but this time we're going to actually raise it. As you can see, when you raise it, all the details get brighter. And this is actually using contrast to focus the details of the image. And the same thing, shift delete. And you filled it with black. If you're going to be selective, you would always fill the layer mask with black. But this time we're going to be painting. So find a very soft brush. What the brush is just pretty much a pen that you paint. You can see that. Let me show you. Anything you paint white will show up on the image. So we're going to be using the brush to bring light into this overall photo. So you have to choose, for the brush, you look at the settings up here. Flow, I like 50, because if you do 100% flow, the brush is very hard. And also make sure your hardness is at 0. If you're doing 100% hardness, you're getting very solid lines. So this is more for kind of if you're doing any writing or if you're sketching or something. But for photographs, I would do hardness 0. And to bring out the hardness tab here, when you have the brush on your screen, just right click. When you right click, this window will pop up, and here you can adjust the hardness. If another way to adjust it is if you click this, the brush settings tab, and you can adjust hardness here. There's a lot more settings here, but don't have to worry about it, because we're not really doing any digital art. So hardness at 0, flow, I personally prefer it at 50. And opacity, that really depends on the image. If we're painting light, we can try 30%. And just do a big brush first. And just pull it in. Do it a couple times. And then you can do a few small ones. And I'll show you the before and after. And this way you kind of create a really yeah, so I'll show you the normal image first. 1 second. Yeah, so this is what we had before, and this is what we have now. You can see that the mood is coming out, and you can see that there's a band of light here that normally was not. So it just adds that extra bit of magic, and it makes your image feel more, I guess it feels more special in a sense, and different. And these little things kind of bring out, I guess, yeah, it'll bring out the feeling of, I guess, magic or mood. Let me check for questions. All right, yeah, thank you, thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, if you want to invert a layer mask, you can just Control I or Command I. Totally didn't think of that. Thank you. Let me just check. All right, so yeah, let's do another edit for this, but this time we'll make the entire sky blown up. We'll just give me a second. All right, so this one's going to be very contrast. I'm going to be doing something like this. And what this does is, what this kind of shows is that there's like this feel where, you know, a lot of times the sky is overexposed, but not overexposed to the point where your eyes are like, that's way too bright. But then it also helps you focus on the landscape, and it gives you that, I guess it gives you that simple feel, I guess. So we'll just go through that. So the first thing I would do is I would just do a really crazy S-curve. Oops. Always drop this part, because if you're keeping it up here and you're making all the skies overexposed, you're going to have a very bright image. Raise this up by a tiny bit. Bring the shadows out. We're actually going to add some contrast here, I think. All right. Increase the exposure a bit. I'm just doing some adjustments. Let's see. We're going to give it a bit of a colder color. And same thing with split toning. We'll give it a green. And why I like giving greens is during a rain or cloudy day, a green and blue makes a pretty nice combination. Let's see. Saturation, we're actually going to decrease. Vibrance, we will increase. Yeah, so I'm actually going to drop the blacks. Now for highlights. Highlights we're going to increase. And whites we will decrease. Like I said, if you're going to increase one, you should lower the other to keep everything more balanced. That's why raising highlights, you would lower whites. Raising shadows, you would lower blacks. And it also creates a bit of a contrast when you do this. Let's see. Alright, so this is a bit more faded. Yeah, we're going to fade it like that. Whoops. And for curves, you can just keep it an S curve. You can just move the points on the curve a bit by bit, and you can tell that, and you can see the changes it's making. You can see that when you're moving it here, the S is becoming more obvious. And the more obvious the S, the stronger the contrast. So, whoops. Let's see, something like that. And I feel like the white's a bit too strong. You put it here, you can see that the white's actually popping way too much. So just lower it a bit. You can lower it to like here. Something like that. And now we use the gradient filter. Normally, if you're going to underexpose, I will lower the temperature by a bit and just drag. So let's see. And you don't need to use one slider to make it look the way you want. You can do multiple. You can add one in here. You can add another one in here. And you can see that. Because when you use one, you're going to get a very strong change in one area. But if you combine a few, you're going to get a really soft and, I guess, evenly spread adjustment. But I do notice the blues are getting a bit more strong too, so lower the blues a bit. Because this image we're going to focus on greens, we want greens to be the main color, so we can also play with luminance. So hue, the HSL tab, I'm sure everyone knows what they are, but I'll just explain luminance. What it does is, just think of dodge and burning. You're actually, if you're raising it, you're dodging the specific color. So anything that's close to green, when you slide it to the right, it'll be brighter. If you slide it to the left, it'll be darker. So we want the greens to be popping, so we slide the greens to the right. And yellow, because for yellow, it just depends. Like for this image, I personally want the yellows to be a bit darker, so I would slide the yellows to the left. And everything else, there's not much. I don't think there's any other colors. Same for orange, because orange and yellow are really close to each other. I want the orange to be darker as well, because the main focus of this picture art for me is the green trees. Yeah, so at this point, we can also add another light source. It's always nice to have one band of light coming from a corner. It really adds more. More to the photo, in my personal opinion. And if you're going to bring light in, I normally add a bit more warmth. And raising exposure, it's not always good to raise highlights as well, because because in here the overall image is really you have a really overexposed area in here. Raising highlights will just make that even more overexposed. And try not to when you're doing the radial filter, try to be as specific as possible, so you don't really want to cover this area too. But it also depends the way you want the light to be coming down. Sometimes you want the light to be also on the water as well, so you can do something like this. And I actually like how this is looking, so we'll probably do this. And depending on where you're dropping the radial filter, you have to adjust this accordingly. So because we're also getting some sky, and we would lower some highlights. Shadows, it comes to how you want the image to look. Because this is a light ray, if you want the light to pretty much shine on the trees as well, you would raise the shadows. If you don't, it'll look something like this. But if you, let's say you want the light to also hit the forest, just raise the shadows a bit. Whites, I won't really touch, because if you're raising the whites, you're going to make that part really crazy. Blacks also depends. If you want the image to look a bit more faded, you would raise the blacks. If you want that strong contrast in the shadows, you would keep blacks at 0. I'll show you. So we want a little bit of a faded look, because that kind of resembles the light is kind of coming down. And let me just go. Camera raw defaults. So this was the before, and this is the after. This is, yeah. I don't normally do this type of edit, because it's really, I really love details, and that's why I like something like this. It just feels more dynamic, and it feels more cinematic, I guess. Once you have this, we're going to go back to camera raw again. And this is why, yeah, so when I first started photography, this is probably the end of the year. I've figured that if I keep applying camera raw presets, it's going to make the picture extra moody and extra colorful. So I'm just going to show you some quick ways. Let me just see. Yeah, like you can give it a cold blue, or you can give it a warm again, or you can give it contrast, or you can make it softer. That's why I really love camera raw. It's just that applying 2 presets onto the image, it's so quick and so convenient. Let's say we go with something like this. We can just adjust the color. The greens are a little bit strong, so yellow's a bit strong. Yeah, so we can just do a little bit of adjustment, and it'll look completely different from the before. But let's say we want something that's more cold. We just do another adjustment. And let's say we apply a contrast one. It's just many different, you can just, what I'm trying to explain is that you can do multiple presets or multiple edits onto one image, is how you get the color and mood. And you can bring that to a whole new level, versus if you're just going to adjust it in one go. Because you can only adjust saturation or like a setting to 100 per edit. But because in Photoshop you can apply camera raw an infinite amount of times, you can keep raising saturation. So I'm just gonna show you that. Like you can do vibrance up 100, even though it's really crazy right now. Let's see. Actually, you can go back to camera raw. You can apply the vibrance again, and then you can keep applying it. So any image that's not colorful will become colorful if you apply enough layers. And you guys always ask, how do I get my colors out? The answer is just raise saturation or raise vibrance, raise those until the colors are actually visible. And you can see that we turned a really colorless kind of image. A colorless image like this can become super saturated like this through many different layers. Yeah, let me just go back. Let's see. All right, so what we'll do with this image is we're going to make it even more faded and moody. So let's do another S-curve, but this time because the whites are already really strong, just don't really go over the line. So what this middle line means is that this diagonal line is that if you raise the, just show you. So the initial curve is just here. If you raise it over this little white horizontal line thing, this slanted line, it's going to be brighter than what it used to be, and anything that's under it is going to be darker than what it used to be. And because the reason why an S curve gives it so much contrast is that the brighter areas are becoming brighter and the darker areas are becoming darker. And because there's a change, because two of the ends are going even more apart, that's what creates contrast. And we raise this little tail because we don't want all the details on, because we did the S curve and we raised before, there's a lot of details pretty much clumped in one dark, kind of like one tier of darkness. And we raise that to kind of undo the S we're making. And because the whites are already very strong, so we're not going to go too much over the line. So something like this. And you can already see that contrast and mood's already being added into the image. And here we're going to be playing with more radial filters. Radial filters add so much for a photo, especially if you're not doing any selective dodge and burning or anything. This is probably the best tool to bring an image from what it looks to something magical, I guess. And you can see already that the radial filters bring in a light here, and it's kind of lighting up this area. And now we're going to do an underexposed radial filter. And what this does is it brings more attention to that light over here. A really easy way to, let's say you want to replicate this radial filter, but you already made a new one here. Just click this one and then just drag, and then you made an exact copy of it. So we're just going to make it look like there's light coming from the top down, something like that. As you can see, because it's covering the strongest area is over the highlights. or over the brightest parts of the image, we do not want to raise highlights, or else it's going to be like, or else it's going to be a overexposed mess. But if I raise highlights to 100, you can see that the effect is most obvious here, and you can see the drop off kind of here. So we'll lower highlights. And shadows, we're actually going to lower a bit to give the forest some layer. As you can see, if we raise shadows to 100, you're just going to see a bunch of trees and not much depth. But if we lower shadows, you're going to see some darker areas. And that's what we want, because this makes it look more realistic. Because when light comes down, it has to be, it comes to, for this image, it's coming down at an angle. So anywhere here shouldn't, so if you look at here, they're not being lit up. So this part shouldn't either. And one thing to notice, one thing to know is that to make an image look realistic, you have to follow light. If you're going against light, or if you're going against light, let's say for here, but the light here is, you're not adjusting here, it's just going to oppose each other, and it's not really going to turn out that great. And then we'll add another bit, another one really thin, just highlighting, just something like that. Just a band of light coming kind of through the forest. We'll make this extra warm, something like that. And this kind of resembles a light ray. You can do multiple ones. Let me just show you. Something like that. So it just kind of shows like a few, yeah, that's why radial filters are so amazing. You can do a lot with it. Anything with light, it's amazing. Sometimes I won't really dodge a light ray in. I will just use radial filter for the lighting, and then you click OK. Yeah, so these are the two editing styles I wanted to show today. One is more dynamic and very soft, but it also feels a bit cinematic. This one's a lot stronger, a lot more moody, but everyone has their own preferences. Yeah. Let me just check for how can I start photography? I know little or nothing about cameras, but it was something I would like to learn. Yeah, so I guess that'll be the question I finish off with. So if you're interested in photography and you still haven't started, totally just take your smartphone, take pictures, edit them with whatever application you have on your phone. And then if it's still really growing onto you, and you're really enjoying it, definitely pick up a camera, something small, something you can maybe play around with on your computer. And then you can try the mobile editing apps, like there's Photoshop Mix, I think, and there's also Lightroom Mobile and Snapseed or something. Just try those, and as you progress and you understand all the basics and settings, you can start advancing up more and more. Yeah, so I think that's it for the video for today. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and yeah, I'll try to think of more topics and stuff for the coming weeks. And if there's any suggestions or anything you think I should cover or talk about, just definitely send me a message or let me know in the comments. Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in, and hope you guys have a great start to the week. It's going to end live video, and I'll end the one here too.